Talking sports and more from coast to coast. We've got a great topic for you today. We're covering youth baseball, talking about injury risk prevention and much more with Dr. Grant H. Garcia, one of the top orthopedic surgeons and sports medicine specialists. You can check him out at grantgarciamd.com. He's also part of the orthopedic specialists of Seattle. Dr. Garcia, welcome. Thanks for taking some time to join me and talk about a subject that not only coaches are interested in, but a lot of parents. So I appreciate your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Covering youth baseball. I mean, as a parent, I go out there, I'm working with my son. We're throwing balls all over the place. I've got him pitching. I'm in the outfield. I'm hitting grounders. I'm doing all these things supposedly as a good parent that this is what we're supposed to be doing, trying to get our kids ready. What are some of the risks when you're covering and when you're talking about baseball as a parent, as a coach, that you have to look out for as far as maybe overuse with all of this arm work that we're getting?
That's a good question. So I think the biggest thing is understanding that until you're youth baseball, your kids are still growing, until they're 15, 16, especially boys. So the biggest thing is overuse injuries at the growth plates. So we can call it something called Little League Shoulder, where the growth plate gets stretched and angry. In addition, there's Little League Elbow, where you can do the same sort of thing. It sort of like mimics a Tommy John injury, but the good news is that both of those usually need no surgical treatment. It's just rest. And so overuse injuries are pretty common. And especially when you're working with parents or parents are working with their kids, they tend to sort of push them as much as they can, what they feel comfortable, but always trying to make sure their kid has their best interests in mind. But obviously you can cause people to have injuries when they're not understanding that you sort of take the steps to rest the arm and do appropriate things. That's usually why when they're with coaches, it leaves a little bit easier and a little bit more monitored, in my opinion. But it's almost impossible to get enough one-on-one coaching time, so it is good that parents are involved.
So is the over the head, over the shoulder injury the most common injury that you'll see in a sport like baseball, whether it's your UCL or a shoulder injury?
The most common injuries in the shoulder I see are usually something called a slap tear. A lot of baseball players have it, and that's the one most common thing. Most of the time you can treat it without surgery. For the elbow, it's usually what we call an elbow strain. So like I mentioned before, Little League Elbow, which is where it's a strain of the growth plates. When the players are older and they're 16 or above, we start worrying about the Tommy John ligament or the UCL. The other thing you can have is a flexor strain, which is the flexors of the arm are right above the Tommy John ligament. And so those are the backup stabilizer for the elbow, and those get strained. And so it's my job as a orthopedic surgeon to figure out which one is the problem. Is it the UCL or is it the flexors? Because flexors are pretty easy. That's rest. Tommy John, that's talking about something surgical. So it's really those combinations. Those are the things I see the most out of baseball players.
Now, does age play a part as far as the treatment, whether it's a 11-year-old that's having elbow issues or a 18, 19, 20-year-old? What's the difference as far as treatment, or is there not a difference? If you have a severity of an injury, you treat it the same way?
A great question. So the first thing is when they're 18, you eliminate that possible Little League elbow. So we like to assume that they have a growth plate strain, and so we start off with just rest right away. When they're a little bit older, we start to say, okay, rest is a good idea, but we're getting more worried. I tend to pull the trigger on getting an MRI when someone's 18 and they come in with a lot of elbow issues. When they're 11, I tend to do the rest first and then consider an MRI because I assume they likely have, which is the more common thing, which is the Little League elbow.
Dr. Garcia, if you performed a specific surgery and it changed the landscape of surgery, why would you want it called after somebody else? As, for example, Tommy John, right? We call it the Tommy John surgery, and as sports fans, we know exactly what we're talking about, right? There's the UCL injury. We've seen it this year with Justin Verlander, a bunch of other guys, and it's been happening on and off, but it's really Dr. Frank Jobe that performed this UCL injury reconstruction in 1974. I would be highly upset. I want it named after me, not after the player that I performed the surgery on. Am I delusion here?
That's a good comment. Well, you stole my line. I'm going to use that with Frank Jobe, but that's great that you had it. So, yes, it was developed by Frank Jobe. He's at Curl and Jobe Institute in California. And, I don't think he was upset about it. Trust me, he performed plenty of those surgeries on players and took care of all the high-level baseball players. I think the thing to understand is that Tommy John was the first player, and before this, it was sort of experimental. And Tommy John took a risk by doing this surgery, and I don't think anybody named it because it was intended to be that way. It's just that that's kind of the way we do. And honestly, I like to say UCL surgery or medial collateral ligament surgery, but nobody has any idea what I'm talking about. And so as a result, I constantly use Tommy John surgery. Even on my website and for marketing purposes, I discuss the word Tommy John because no one has any idea what a UCL is. And in a lot of cases, there's multiple UCLs. There's UCLs of the thumb, of the elbow, and so it's very confusing for people. And I understand Frank Jobe might have been frustrated about it, but I think that he had a good enough business model that I don't think he was too upset.
All right, I'm just letting you know if you come up with a new pattern of some kind of reconstruction surgery that advances technology, we needed to call it the Dr. Garcia, the Dr. Grant H. Garcia. You could pick however we want to call it, but there's no way that we're calling it after the player that you performed the surgery. So I just want to get that out of the way because it was something that's
I think that's fair.
It's on my mind. I don't understand how that works, but I guess we all sacrifice for the greater good, and I guess that's what the doctor did. We see that baseball, or at least the numbers would suggest that baseball is by far the highest percentage of injuries over that shoulder overhead. Why do you think that is compared to basketball or maybe volleyball or some of these other sports, gymnastics? Why do we see such a high level percentage of those type of injuries with baseball players?
That's a great question. So first off, we could talk about both the shoulder and elbow because usually they're linked. So first off, it is the highest rate of injuries. It's because it's the main focus of baseball. I mean, it's all about pitching. It's all about throwing. It's all about throwing harder. It's all about throwing faster. And what they're doing and what you're doing with the arm is you're actually throwing in a situation that's not normal. So if you watch a pitcher in slow motion, you can see they externally rotate their arm or cock their arm back more than you could possibly ever do. Take a look at a pitcher in the newspaper. We saw one recently, and you can see his arm almost completely backwards. If you try to do that right now with your arm, even if you're younger, et cetera, trying to do it with your arm and you haven't stiffened up, you can't do it. You need to adapt to that level. And so as a result, you're putting extra torque on your body that's not physiological. And then you're being asked to throw 95 miles an hour. And so that's a bad combination. And if you do that, anything ineffective, which happens a lot if you're not a professional pitcher and you're getting someone watching your form and watching your stance and you're using weighted balls, et cetera, it's a recipe for disaster. And the other problem is that some of the injuries are actually accommodative. So a slap tear, like I mentioned before, is actually really common. And when I looked at a bunch of the Major League Baseball players, talking about the Yankees, the Mets, the White Sox, 40% of them have this. And the reason is, if they don't have this tear, they can't cock their arm back as far. And so as a result, you have a problem that sometimes needs surgery, but in this situation, if it doesn't need surgery, it's actually accommodative. And so that's the problem. And then you have the Tommy John ligament that's never supposed to see stresses that much in normal life. And meanwhile, it happens all the time and have seen stresses that high in baseball. And honestly, if you look at the number of people with Tommy John injuries or UCL injuries, it's like 90% are baseball players. I see them occasionally in other sports, but it's all baseball because they're putting so much more physiological load than any other sport.
Going back to that image that you mentioned, you see the force, the strain, the torque. You see it all the way from it seems like from their toes all the way up. And I always find it interesting when you talk about an image like that it almost seems like when the arm is back or the hand is back, the elbow is leading the way before the pitch is thrown and before the rest of the arm kind of catches up. What kind of strain is that putting on when you see that? And is there, I guess the better question is there anything that we know of or that we can do as a pitcher, if you're coaching a pitcher, that can do to release some of that strain in that elbow area? Or is this something that's just unavoidable because everybody's just bigger, stronger, faster?
I think it's a combination. I mean, there's definitely the point of having a pitching coach or in slow motion. I mean, a lot of the pros we have and I've taken care of, we do these you can do these simulated pitching where you put a bunch of those balls like you see in the movies on them and you watch their pitching thing because you really can't see their arm unless you're in slow motion for some of these pitchers because they throw so fast. And then you can watch the mechanics and see how the elbow leads or whether it leads backwards or forward. So those things are obviously important. You can't fix everything because in order for you to throw that much, you have to have a beyond physiological motion. And so you do have some level that's not fixable, and you have some level that's fixable. The biggest thing for doctors, but really mostly for the teams and the trainers, is to figure out how we can double check and watch their motion and figure out the places we can tweak to reduce injuries. But at the same point, we have to find things that are not reducible either and say, okay, that can't be fixed. We have to deal with this. But the biggest thing, again, and we might talk about this later, is understanding the awareness of what's the next step. Like if someone's a sore arm, what's the difference between a sore arm or like a pre-injury or a pre-tear of the Tommy John ligament? And those are the biggest things we need to pick up on. I think we're getting better, but that's really needed to do it. And there's a lot of things talking about wearables. So something you wear on your elbow, and I know I've worked with a couple companies that have done this, where these players, they wear things on their elbow and it can tell when they start to get fatigued rather than dealing with a pitch count type of thing.
Oh, that is extremely interesting. I haven't seen that yet, so that's fascinating to think that something like that is being developed. Let's go back to the Little League and really the amateur coach, amateur parent, amateur player. What are the concerns, or what is some of the conversations that should be had when you're talking with a player as far as pitching? Because everyone is learning to pitch, right? Learning to throw that ball. Doing the extra work when you're not at practice. How much time do you take off? What should be some of those common communications to protect the player from injury?
I think the biggest thing is understanding you need to rest. It's not about pitching every single day. It's not about constantly throwing something. There has to be rest involved. I mean, there's a reason that the Little League has pitch counts and days of rest that are required. There's been a number of studies that show if you don't adhere to those things, then you can cause issues. Another thing is to, be careful of weighted balls. That's another problem, which we'll try to get, is they try to get velocity. So they have these weighted balls that can be an issue as well. And understanding to listen to your body. I mean, it's really hard. I deal with a lot of kids and a lot of baseball players and a lot of parents that listening to your arm is, if it's sore, kids are used to being like sore and then they get better the next day. So they push through it. And if they're on a select team and they know if they don't pitch that day, they're going to be cut from the team and they're concerned about it.
Wow. No.
Or they want to go to the pros. It's every day is a struggle for them to try to decide, is this injury real or should I push through it? And most of the time they're trying to push through it until it's sort of the big one.
So really having that open communication, I guess an honest conversation with the player and the parent, and, whether the coach is saying, little Johnny or whatever, let us know when you're not feeling well. Let us know when you have some fatigue, when you have some soreness. Hey, mom and dad, let's not push them. I know you want them to get better. Everybody's reading every kind of book, whether it's a Leo Mazzoni or Trevor Bauer or this one or that one. This one's, Roger Clemens, we know, right? Roger Clemens would throw a football, right? Trevor Bauer's talking about long toss and throwing every day. So there's a lot of information out there. I'm not sure how much of it is accurate, but really seems like having that communication between player, parent, and coach is important for the well-being of the player.
Couldn't agree more.
What is the thought process about playing a sport all year round compared to a seasonal? We see a lot of that in warmer states, whether it's California or Texas, Nevada, so on and so forth, where they can play baseball all year round. What are some of the concerns with the sport when you play all year round compared to someone that says, I'm going to play basketball, I'm playing track, and baseball in the spring?
That's a great question, and it comes up a lot. We spoke at Swedish about this about a year ago. It's a big deal. So this super specialization is getting more and more common. I mean, I would tell you, 9 out of 10 baseball players that come in my office are super specialized. You're talking about 8 months or more of a year. That's considered the super specialization or sort of isolated one sport. It's a problem everywhere. I mean, even in places that are not warm weather, players find ways to play. And here in Seattle, they find ways to play in the rain. They find ways to play in covered areas, etc. You have a much higher risk of these sort of big injuries, like big shoulder injuries, big elbow injuries when you do that. You have less risk of sort of the chronic injuries like cramps or sprains or those type of things. But it's a big deal. And it's a problem in terms of a number of things. One, you get, when your kids are younger before they finish growing, they can actually change the structure of their bones by throwing so much. And if they overthrow, they can change the orientation of the growth plates, et cetera. And it's not a long major issue, but it's something to think about. And so not having the ability to try other things or do other things or get a break, it can lead to injuries that eventually cause them to be out of the sport they want to do. And it takes away their fun because, I have players, I talk to them, I was like, can you take a break? They're like, no, I've got winter ball. Well, how about now I've got fall ball?
Yeah.
How about now I got spring ball? Or I'm going down to, California or Florida or wherever it is for 4 weeks to play baseball, in the winter. So they find ways to play baseball all year round, even if it's not a warm weather sport or warm weather place.
Yeah, I've heard that from other coaches, coaches that I respect and are really honest about their sport. And they say, we're getting these kids at 15, 16 years old really they're already kind of burnt out. They've played so much little league ball, travel ball, and so on and so forth, and they're playing all year round that by the time they get to that 15, 16, 17 years old, they really don't want to play anymore. And so one, it's, the love of the sport, overusing them, and also concern for what it's doing to their body. That's fascinating to hear that by playing the same sport can actually change your body structure and be a detriment. So it's really fascinating to hear that. Is there a danger with these younger kids? And I have my own opinion on it, but who am I, right? I'm just a parent. With kids throwing fastballs to kids throwing breaking balls, curveballs, sliders at an early age, is there any truth to that, or is it all the same?
I think it's a combination. I mean, it also depends on the kids. There's some kids that are 12 that look like they're 20.
Gotcha.
And there's some kids that are 12 that are still growing. So it's really growth plate dependent, in my opinion. Now, again, there's not an art to this. I think that understanding each pitch's torque on the elbow is important. And it's everything like in anything in life. It's a gradual progression of teaching the pitch. There's definitely certain parameters we should be reducing, the curves and things like that put more torque on the elbow in general. But we should work on those things and work our way up to them. I don't have a specific, this at 13, this at 14. I sort of do it by player.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not a coach, so I'm not doing the adjustments on a day-to-day basis. I do give recommendations. If I hear about a pitcher trying to throw every pitch that's in Major League Baseball at 10, tell them it's probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
And again, biggest thing is worrying about burnout too. You used to keep trying to do different pitches and they're not working, you're frustrated, you're going to get sick of it too. So you got to be careful with all that stuff.
Going back to Little League, you go to a Little League game, you have a kid come out, he pitches whatever either the pitch count or innings, whatever the plan is, and then you'll have let's say your outfielder, shortstop, switch with him, come into the game, throw a couple warm-up pitches, and get ready to play. What's some of the dangers or concerns when you have a player come into the game, step in to pitch, and has not maybe warmed up properly? What do you think or recommend is the correct way to kind of handle that situation?
Well, I think if you don't think they're warmed up properly, you should probably not have them start yet. Now, that's easier said than done. I think it's a combination of two things. In Little League, you have an outfielder coming in to pitch. Always the pitchers are sitting there, in the bullpen waiting to pitch. So that's the first thing. They're not used to pitching as much. And then they get in there and they want to show off because they've got, 10 pitches to do, and then they hurt themselves. So that's the first thing.
Yeah, and the ump also has it's almost like a warm-up pitch count also, saying, okay, he's got 8 tosses and then we got to go.
Yeah.
So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I mean, I don't know enough about the exact nuance to that in terms of is there a warm-up pitch count per se. But what I would tell you is if I'm a player or if I'm the coach or parent or whoever watching this, I'm making sure that those pitches or warm pitches are good pitches. It's not like, okay, he's just kind of playing around, getting ready to throw, and then now it's time to go throw as hard as I can to strike out all those guys. You got to simulate everything in life, and we talked about this the last time too on the podcast. I mean, you got to simulate game time before you get in the game, or you're going to hurt yourself.
Yeah.
And so going in there and saying, I'm going to throw I'm going to say a Little Leaguer goes 70 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour. I'm going to throw 40 and a couple just long toss pitches, and then I'm going to go in there and throw 70. No, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, it was always a concern for me because you'll have guys, especially in Little League, the ball hardly ever gets, hit out there. If you have a couple coaches, you might have a coach that when they hit the field again, you can have the outfielders throw to one another, but that's rare also. So you've got, a player out there maybe hasn't done anything for 3 or 4 innings except maybe to come up at bat, and then all of a sudden he gets brought into a game. I believe it was either 8 or 10 pitches to warm up, and then the batter steps in the batter's box, and we can see it without even doing any science behind it. The kid's not ready. He's not throwing as hard. His location's off, and I always wondered what that would do to the arm, let alone the psyche, but the arm of the player that's obviously he's not properly warmed up. in comparison to the pitcher that starts that day, the coach will have him warm up and throw pitches to the catcher on the side 10, 15 minutes before the game even starts. So, to me, that was always an interesting dynamic with the starting pitcher compared to guys coming in.
I think it's a great point. And like I mentioned before, that's even if, I think pitchers are their own specialization in and of itself. When we treat baseball players, I treat pitchers and I treat position players.
Yeah.
And I have different treatment regimens for each one of them. The position players are less likely to get the Tommy John injuries, et cetera. They're more likely to get the strains and the lumps and the bruises and those type of things from pitching too hard or having a strained elbow. The pitchers are more likely to get the UCL tears, and it's because no matter how hard you throw that 5 or 6 throws, it's really hard for you to really damage your ligament with only 5 or 6 throws. It's the 50, 60, 70 pitches, one game, over and over again. And this is the issue we have in general with these players. They're 15, they've already pitched, 10,000 pitches.
Wow.
That's a lot on the ligament. And so what we're seeing is these Tommy Johns we're doing on younger players, some of the newer stuff, the Tommy John with brace that we can talk about, we're seeing ligaments that look like they're 20 and they're 50.
Wow.
And so that's the biggest concern.
If you go to littleleague.org, they all, have their recommendations. You mentioned it earlier, as how many pitches they should throw in a week, how many days off, and they also talk about really how many pitches they should be throwing in a season, which I don't know any coach that's keeping those type of analytics. They talk about 1,000 pitches per season for 14 and under and 3,000 a year and so on and so forth. So I think it's really difficult for a coach to keep track of all of that, but I obviously with the conversation that we're having, it's really important to really keep track of your pitches and how much strain they're actually having.
I couldn't agree more. There's a reason the Little League rules in 2007 started this. There's pitch counts. Obviously, it's a recommendation, but this is science. There's science showing that if you can reduce the pitches appropriately and you give a certain amount of rest, they looked at pitchers before that and how they got injured in the 90s and realized, if you're 10 and under, you should really limit to 75 a day. And if if you throw 60 plus pitches, you need three more days of rest. And then there's numbers that go out to high school. And there's a reason that this data is there so the coaches don't have to make the decision. This data is there so that you could be completely, out of the loop. You don't have to make any gut calls. Okay, he looks a little tired. Yeah. He looks like he's going to hurt himself. You just follow the rules. It makes it a lot easier. As soon as you take out the emotions, you can feel better about the decision and know, hey, I'm doing this behind science.
Dr. Garcia, I really appreciate your time today. And I think a lot of people listening will appreciate the information that you just shared with everyone.
Well, thank you guys very much for having me. It was fun.
Okay. You take care of yourself, Doctor. That is Dr. Grant H. Garcia, orthopedic surgeon and sports medicine specialist. Please check him out at grantgarciamd.com. This man has authored over 70 publications in prominent peer-reviewed journals, including American Journal of Sports Medicine, Journal of Shoulder and Elbow Surgery, Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery. This man knows what he's talking about. He's been assistant team physician for the Bulls, the White Sox. He's worked with the Giants, the Mets, U.S. Tennis, the Rangers, the Knicks, the Nets. You name it. So he's a great guy to have on. Great doctor for information. We're going to start doing shows bi-weekly. We're going to try to tackle the topics that are important to you, that matter, that we can provide you with plenty of information. And please feel free to send any recommendation of shows that you want to listen to. This is what we're here for. So once again, we really appreciate Dr. Grant Garcia's time today. We're out.